Hi there, and welcome to another interview. I'm really super excited. I hate that expression, but I thought I'd use it because I have a guest on that was very kind to me 5 years ago when I had about, 2 subscribers on my YouTube channel, but he still spoke to me, which is great. So I just want to welcome Ivor Cummins. Hi, Ivor.
Great to see you again, Stephen. And in Manchester, I don't know, 6 months ago or something, maybe.
Yes, yeah, we were at a big conference there. It was nice to meet you, but I guess most people know you, so I'm not going to give you an introduction. So there you go. I'm going to get straight into the questions because this is one thing that bothers a lot of people, and you're the man. So there's a lot of information about the LDL, cholesterol causing heart issues, which I tend to think of as a myth. But there's plenty of information. You can find out that, for instance, the first person that put this theory forward was feeding rabbits cholesterol dissolved in vegetable oil. We also know that Harvard scientists were paid to implicate fat, not sugar. There's countless studies that have been proven to be fraudulent, and there's also been countless mega fines and lots of damages for cholesterol lowering drugs. So with all this information, why do you think people still cling on to this ridiculous theory?
Yeah, it's just inculcated theories, over a half century or more. So it began in earnest in the 80s, this cholesterol myth. And basically, when every authority pretty much spouts the same theory that's very appealing and it makes logical sense, very, very appealing, simple and appealing. Cholesterol is found in the plaque, the atherosclerotic plaque, clearly, and that's a fact. Cholesterol substances are in there. And fat, they show a sink and a drain. Up until even 2009, I think, in Britain, they showed that ad, and then it was taken down in embarrassment because it was getting a little embarrassing at that stage. But it was a beautiful image used for decades. Fat going down the drain will clog the pipes, and it will. It's true. So cholesterol's in the arteries, fats, intuitively, fat in your blood is a bad thing, and that's true. So when you have high blood fats, you're diabetic, you have free fatty acids. So even that's true. But the actual real truth of cholesterol, fat, and heart disease is a little more subtle and nuanced and a little counterintuitive. Because, of course, the fats you eat, triglycerides, are healthy food energy, and they're split when they come through your stomach into 3 monoglycerides, and then they're repackaged together into chylomicrons and sent around the body. So the idea that the fat would just willy-nilly get from what you eat into your blood is absurd. It's completely processed to the nth degree. So that's not intuitive. So they use the intuitive, simplistic kind of visuals, and people agree with them because they make sense to the average layperson. The layperson has no knowledge of the science. That's what they trade on, of course. All the pharmaceutical and the food companies, they know the vast majority have no clue about the actual metabolic science. So if you keep up a big lie, i.e. so big, after decades, it becomes impossible to believe that it could be a lie. Humans are like that. They're just saying, yeah, so all the experts have been wrong for a half century. Ha, ha, ha. And this is the ignorance of the masses. Yes, when there's collusion, mistakes are made. They turn out to be profitable to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. I'm not saying originally they made it up to make money. I think they got lucky, the scientists were idiots, and they made a mistake. But when the mistake starts making hundreds of billions of dollars and basically funds the 2 biggest and most corrupt industries on the planet Earth, which are food and pharma, okay, you got arms manufacturers, but you know what I mean, the huge ones, there's no way that'll be allowed to change. So industry simply funds key opinion leaders, KOLs, and this is documented. They fund the top professors in cardiology and food science and nutrition, and they only need to fund a tiny percentage of the experts. Because once they've got a few top guys in their pocket, well, they're thought leaders. And no one else wants to get in trouble by saying it's all a lie. And if a person says, like, the kid in the emperor's new clothes, says, hold on a second, the emperor's naked, and points out, and we'll get to that in a moment, the obvious disparities with this ludicrous hypothesis. Well, if someone points it out, they're going to get in trouble. Their grants are going to be stopped, and they're going to be called a conspiracy theorist. And that seals the deal. And that's why it keeps going.
I think one of the things that annoys me is like I say, seemingly intelligent people just won't open the door to any sort of thinking about this. And the biggest example I have, and I think you've heard this before, is people will go to their doctor and they will have a lower body composition problems and lower blood pressure. Their diabetes will be reversed. They'll be sleeping better. They'll have less anxiety. The doctor will actually say, "You look amazing. What have you been doing?" And they'll say, "Well, I've been doing ketogenic diets." "Oh, well, that'll kill you." And that'll kill you because LDL is high. And I think that's one of the things that doesn't make sense to me. Do you think that any of them will actually start looking at the evidence of their eyes rather than what they're paid to say?
Yeah, generally, you'd like to say, yes, everyone's going to wake up in the next few years and boom, it'll all be about truth and science. We're not naive. So the doctors, I mean, it is, and this is not a judgment or criticism, it is just a fact, and I know it. And I have a vast array of doctors in my network and professors and academics at a high level. And they would say the same. There's an enormous arrogance in medicine. And especially as people now, become Google doctors, the arrogance it's become even more entrenched that lay people, don't know medicine. I spent 6 years sweating my butt off to do medicine. And in fairness, I have relations who've been through it. You learn a mountain of stuff. It's challenging. So then you come out the other side, you're not going to tolerate lay people telling you about stuff they saw on the internet. And that's where they treat anything questioning cholesterol, because they know to a certainty that cholesterol is clearly one of the major drivers of heart disease. They know that. They don't think it, because there's no way their whole profession has been wrong on a fundamental for a half century. That can't be possible. So that's their mindset. So they're lost. But what was the other question by the absurdity of it? The absurdity of it is self-evident, in spite of what I just said. I mean, in critical thinking and in coming to facts in a nuanced issue, the key thing is to create a hypothesis, okay? And then the key thing is not to prove the hypothesis. I found out decades ago in complex problem solving, you actually kind of largely have to do the opposite most of the time. You need to try and break your hypothesis. And that's because of Professor Karl Popper, one of the fathers of logic philosophy. And he talked about the asymmetry in proof. And it's just a thing of beauty. It seems so obvious, but he is the one who coined or made up the whole thing. And he said there's an asymmetry in proof. And what it essentially means is you can have a hypothesis that cholesterol is a big driver of heart disease. And you can find 1,000 pieces of evidence that indicates that hypothesis appears to be correct. And if you get one piece of evidence that goes against the hypothesis, and if it's dependable, obviously not a trivial, incorrect piece of evidence, but a solid piece of evidence that actually conflicts with that hypothesis, the hypothesis is dead. It's over scientifically. Now, you can rewrite your hypothesis to account for that black swan, but that's a different matter entirely. So with cholesterol, the funny thing is, I have a huge collection of black swans for LDL cholesterol that it cannot be a major driver. And Dr. Malcolm Kendrick, of course, wrote the book, The Clot Thickens, and he puts them all in there. It's easy. So I have literally done blog posts back in 2014-15, just listing the black swans. And remember, as Popper said, one black swan, the hypothesis is over. And we can literally list black swan after black swan. It's a farce. People don't realize it's not just that the cholesterol hypothesis that LDL is a primary driver of heart disease is incorrect. It's laughably incorrect.
Yes.
And that's impossible for people to get into their little peanut skulls because, again, so 50 years of professors in medicine are all wrong? Ha, ha, ha.
Yeah, it's very frustrating. Yeah. I mean, I did, I'm now into my 15th year as a specialist practitioner in diabetes and obesity. But in the first 5 years, I believed all the high carb nonsense. And the type 2 diabetes is a progressive chronic disease and you can never turn it around. I believed that. So I've been in that situation until I started dealing with actual real people. and seeing those results. And I have said this before, but at first I thought, I've got a success here. This person come through the door. This looks good. And to a person, when I asked them what they were doing, they literally said, ignoring your advice and doing Atkins. They didn't say carnivore, they didn't say keto.
Just on that, Stephen, you told a story either, it might have been before you started recording, but about that where someone goes out and does it, and then they get incredible boost in health, they look fantastic, and their blood's outside of LDL, but the ratios, the important measures, are all better. And the doctor still says, you're going to kill yourself. So that's religion. I mean, there's no question, because it's based in no science. It's a religious ideology. It's a belief system, and it's deeply entrenched. But Dr. Ted Naiman, I remember him telling me years ago, he's an engineer originally and then became a doctor, like Dr. Mike Eads and like Dr. Bernstein with the type 1 diabetes. The doctors who were engineers originally and then became doctors are off the scale amazing for obvious reasons. But Naiman said when he was a young doctor and he was working with a couple of big professor types, so he's kind of being mentored, and patients started coming in. It was kind of around the Atkins craze. And he was seeing these patients coming in, and he knew from the science that their bloods were dramatically lowering their risk profile. Some of them were higher in LDL, but he knew about the ratios and HDL. So he's looking at all this, and he's saying to a man or a woman, they all said, well, I'm kind of doing the Atkins diet. So Ted, because he was an engineer, realized one thing with certainty, that no doctor would actually come to this conclusion. He knew with certainty from all the people he saw who were doing it and the consistent, incredible improvement in blood markers, he knew to a certainty it had to be a vastly better diet than the generic diet or the American Heart Diet or whatever. He knew, and he was surprised. He was astonished. And for a while he said nothing, and he kept gathering the data, and then he eventually puckered up the courage, and he went to some of the big boys and said, hey, I'm seeing all these people coming in, and the unifying thing clearly is they're doing this Atkins thing. And he said it was so marked what happened. They grinned and smiled and laughed, and they said, well, be careful, Ted, because if you start advising that, you're liable when they walk out of your office and have a heart attack on the way back to their car. And they all chortled. And then Ted, and this closes the story, Ted realized, again with certainty, my mentors and professors on this topic, which is a big one, like diet and health, are clueless, are literally clueless. And and that was it. And he never looked back. He was a vegan, sort of, white pasty with a paunch. He switched to meat, fish, and eggs and real food. And of course, now he's a slab of muscle. Same old, same old.
So, yeah. And it's just time again, exactly the same. And I think one of the things he probably does talk about is mixing fat and carbohydrates as well. Because, I think he talked about that a bit. Yeah. Anyway, right. You mentioned HDL. Now, one of the things you did at the conference was a brilliant presentation, and you had a graph on there, which, by the way, I'm going to put up on the screen for people. I know we haven't got it, but it pretty much shows how HDL is a much better indicator of cardiovascular disease instances rather than LDL. And I think it's a beautiful graph because it ticks both those boxes. It shows that HDL is a better indicator and LDL isn't. Can you remember that graph off the top of your head?
Oh, I can, yeah. So that one is from Framingham. Yeah. And Framingham was the biggest heart study ever. They're still doing the third generation, I think. It's crazy. But Framingham and Castelli, the director, and he was a cardiologist and a math and probability guy. So he did a paper and kind of said that. He basically said from Framingham, essentially, the things that predict future cardiovascular disease are HDL and triglycerides, not just in the Framingham study, but in the Men's Health, and he listed out the US Vet, whatever. He listed out several other studies. He was basically saying in a published paper in 1991, the head of Framingham was saying, actually, guys, it's HDL and trigs, which is insulin resistance. And he said, unless your LDL is over, I think he said 7.8 millimole or 320 milligram. He said, unless your LDL is over 320 US units or nearly 8 units LDL alone in the UK, he said it really has no predictive power for future events. So Castelli blew the lid on the whole cholesterol nonsense in 1991 from Framingham. And of course, the world looked and said, hold on a minute, we got massive drug classes coming. So they basically just shut him down. Of course, it's corruption. But the graph you're talking about is also framing, and it just illustrates what Castelli said. There's 4 levels of HDL going from high HDL up to very low HDL. And heart disease goes up the y-axis as a number of heart attacks. So you can clearly see the separation of the graphs, that HDL being low dominates high heart attack risk, okay? But LDL goes from left to right. And sure, when LDL gets really high, you get a higher risk of heart disease, but only when the HDL is low. So it's not the LDL. And like an engineer, I shared that in my first presentation, 2012, the metabolic syndrome, with around 100 engineers. I had to do 2 sessions. The biggest room in my corporate could only take 100. And like I'm showing them this, and it was great because they're engineers and technicians, and they're looking at it and they realize, my God, this cholesterol stuff is complete nonsense. And they know it is because I showed them that graph and they are engineers. You know, that's it in a nutshell. That graph alone means you drop talking about LDL completely and you focus on HDL, triglycerides, insulin, adiponectin, leptin. You can have any marker you want once it's not LDL.
Yeah, and I love that graph for its simplicity as well. That is an easy one to show. It still doesn't cut the ice with some friends and family. I've got to be honest. I mean, I've written a book about statins actually, and also about bloods. But even those graphs, they're still entrenched, as you say. They just can't believe it. They just can't believe they've been hoodwinked.
It's the big lie. So if you make the lie, and Goebbels said this, and I think maybe Churchill, there's some debates, but I think Goebbels, of course, in socialist Germany, you know, you tell a lie and you make it big enough and keep repeating it, and eventually people will not be able to believe that it's a lie. It's too big. So little lies, and I think he also gave a quote on this. He actually called it out fully. You know, smaller lies can be turned over. People can kind of question them and then say, hold on a minute. So you need to make the lie huge and pervasive. And then people simply can't believe that it's a lie. It's just too big and it's too established. So they go on the principle of the big lie. And I mean, the viral issue in 2020, 21, same thing. Make the lie so big, so absurd that no one will believe, that all the experts agree and that they're wrong. You can't believe that. They must be right. They got to be right.
Yeah, I think the tide might be turning on that one. The other thing is...
It's good now.
The other thing is, I did say I wrote a book, but you mentioned these graphs.
Love that study.
Yes. Can you just give us a little précis of that study?
Yeah, that actually is one of... It's funny you should raise that graph because it's one of the most beautiful destroyers of the cholesterol hypothesis in itself. But yeah, basically what they did was they scanned the American man of all ages and looked at the amount of calcification, which is the most accurate measure of your extent of heart disease to date. And the score can go up into the thousands for people who have like ceramic arteries. The calcium is brought in to stabilize soft plaque. So if you are riddled with calcium, it means you had masses of soft plaque over your life. It's your extent of disease. And the American men, of course, as you went to the highest percentiles of calcification and as you went older in the graph to the right, the scores got up into the thousands for those groups. And generally, the whole graph is just an explosion of calcification in the American men. And then they went to the Semaine man, I think, in that example, and they scanned them with the same 64 slice technology, like with like. And hey presto, the Semaine man, there's barely anything on the graph, even up to the 60s and 70s in age, and up to the worst calcifiers. There's only a little bump on the graph at the back right-hand corner, right? So you've now got in your hands the ultimate comparative analysis for problem solving. You've got the lowest heart disease men on the planet, and you got pretty much the highest heart disease men on the planet. So you look and say, what's the difference between them in bloods? And what you find out, there's no difference in cholesterol particle count, which is the best measure of LDL. The LDLP or LDL, LDLP or what's they call it again?
LP,
I forget now,
way?
LDLP, but there's another term for it. Passes my mind now. So anyway, the best level of LDL, and even the industry clearly states this now, and Thomas Dayspring and all the pharma guys, they acknowledge that LDL-C, the old measurement, is very confusing and misleading. But they put all their votes into one ballot box. LDLP, the particle count in nuclear magnetic resonance or the more advanced testing. So they put all their everything into that. Well, that's the thing they measure between the Semaine and the Americans, and it's effectively the same. So like that utterly obliterates the cholesterol hypothesis. And even the cholesterol hypothesis using the fancy new LDLP, or particle count. And the funny thing is, Stephen, on Twitter, right, I was in the cholesterol wars years ago before the viral nonsense. And the cholesterol guys, the pharma guys, would argue any point up and down. Associational studies, mechanistic studies, they would argue, and you'd make great points, and they'd argue and they'd argue. And the funny thing was, when I pulled that one out with a grinning face, they ran away. I mean, it was astonishing. They looked and just realized you can't go up against that. So they basically just fade away. I think they knew themselves, but they're invested. A lot of the guys I was arguing with had significant positions with pharmaceutical companies, and they knew, never acknowledge that cholesterol is BS. There is hundreds of billions built on that.
But of course, it lends itself to the question, what was the difference?
Oh, the difference, yeah. I listed in my talks. I go through the Semaine, their glucose is in their boots. Their insulin is in their boots, right? Really low, if you don't know that phrase. They have no metabolic syndrome at all. Americans are probably 80% metabolic syndrome, diabetes type 2, which is the primary driver of heart disease. So what it is actually easy enough. It's insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, and you can add in poor sleep. You can add in, stress. All those things are relevant. But like it's donkey level obvious that the Americans have every real risk factor against them, and the Semaine in their indigenous populations eating meat, fish, and eggs, and healthy carbohydrates that are not mechanically processed, and they don't have vegetable oil. So if you take away the primary cause of heart disease in the population, or you don't introduce them, you don't get heart disease. It's not rocket science.
Well, it's not. The insulin part leads me to this question, because I think you're an advocate of testing bloods. Adiponectin is one of the things I think you say is a good thing to get tested. Why do you say that?
Yeah, you see, insulin resistance is essentially a dysfunction of subcutaneous adipose tissue. And this concept's gone out a lot before, that your personal fat threshold, or PFT. So Indians genetically are less easily able to just produce lots of subcutaneous healthy fat. So they produce a certain amount, and then they tend to pronounce a belly, with visceral fat, because they've got a limit genetically, broadly, not every Indian, broadly. And Dr. Ron Rosedale said, diabetes type 2 is the price you pay for not being able to get any fatter. This is the nub of it. So people who can get very fat with healthy, non-insulin resistant, small, healthy fat cells, lots of them, they don't get diabetic. And on the other extreme, so you can have 400-pound monster men and they're not diabetic. And the other extreme, people with lipodystrophy who are much worse than Indians, they really can't make subcutaneous fat, and they all look ripped. They look great if you really want to be super slim. They've got washboard stomachs and they have very little fat. They are all type 2 diabetic, insulin resistant. So if you take the kernel that the enlarging of your fat cells and the pressure to enlarge them more than they want to be breaks down insulin signaling within the adipocytes, and broadly that is one of the big fundamental things underpinning the insulin resistance hyperinsulinemia problem. Now, you'll have to remind me of your question because that's the preamble. It's all to do with the adipocytes.
Connecting, yeah.
Oh, adiponectin. So,
Yeah.
when it's all to do with the adipocytes, what's better than the ultimate test of your fat cell health? And that's adiponectin and leptin. So, briefly, they may not be too commonly available. I got them in New York from a good friend of mine, Steve Horvitz. He got me a barrage of testing and he refused to let me pay for it. They took 9 vials, full test tubes of blood, because he showed me through all these different laboratories and I was able to go through the menu. So I got everything. But I got adiponectin and leptin. And back then I was healthier than I am now. It was before the viral nonsense. And I came in beautifully because you want your adiponectin as high as possible. And it goes up to 20 is the human range. I think 4 to 20. And mine was 20 plus with an asterisk, out of range. So it was too good. And my leptin, you want it down low in the single digits, but the lower range was 4, and mine was shown as below 4 with an asterisk, outside normal range.
Great.
So my leptin and my adiponectin were both as good as you could get. Now, they might not be now, but I just think they're really good because they don't lie on the health of your adipocytes, and that is so important. I just think it's a beautiful extra test for people, who have a few bob, who like getting blood tests, and they might flag something that the other tests look kind of middle of the road, and the leptin might be surprisingly high and give you a lead to look into your fat distribution, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very old school, and I'm going to admit this. I don't normally say this, but when I started 15 years ago, I was actually told by somebody who had been the diabetic specialist in a clinic for like 30 years before I'd even started. And he said, you know how we used to test diabetes? We'd get the person to walk towards the wall, and if their belly button touched it before any other part, they were probably diabetic.
Yes. And Ted Naiman said that when I interviewed him in Seattle many years ago. I wanted to get the simple core from him for lay people. I was focused on lay people and I didn't want us to have a doctor-engineer chat. And he said, yeah, waist to height ratio is one of the best measures. Forget BMI. And waist to height, you don't have to worry about American or UK units. It's 2 to 1. So if you have half the waist circumference, now it's a harsh measurement. You're meant to stand there and just let your breath out and relax. There's no cheating. But if you let your breath out, very few people have half the waist circumference of their height. Very few. So if you can even approach it, it's pretty good. So it's an amazing measure. And it lines up perfectly with that rule of thumb. I thought you were going to say diabetic tasting the urine, because doctors back 100 years
I'd never do that.
Yeah. But way back they did. Doctors weren't bothered. They would actually just take samples and just taste it back in the early 1900s. Different days.
What you just said, and I reckon you haven't heard this before, but what we used to do was get string, okay, and get the string to the height of the person, and then fold it in half, and that should be a perfect belt. It was perfect. But
how many pass of general population now? I mean,
hardly anyone could do that. Yeah,
I know it's fantastic, but mostly you only have lipodystrophy people who are going to pass it nowadays. But that's it. It's a great measure because it is the true ancestral measure. So if you went back thousands of years ago, or to any indigenous tribe, broadly speaking, that's unaffected by the West, and you get your bit of string, it's going to cover obviously women who are pregnant, or the mamas sometimes eat a lot back at the camp and they get fat, but it's a healthy fat. But you look at all the men, hunters, I mean, they're all going to pass that test.
You see, people don't believe that diabetes 15 years ago was not such a big deal. I mean, I loved Dr. Unwin's talk at the PhD this year, where he said, kids having diabetes when he started was pretty rare, and it was called late onset adult diabetes. That's what it was called, because most people that got diabetes, it was later in life and they were adults. It was unusual. Yeah. So even only just 15 years ago, I'm not really that old, I'm only 60. I mean, I can remember when diabetes was unusual. That's why I was interested in it. Now it is the norm. I mean, all my consultations, I would say at least half have pre-diabetes. I hate that expression, or diabetes. But the other thing I was going to ask you about, actually, and I forgot earlier, and it bugs me, I don't know if it bugs you, is the use of proxy markers. So what I mean by that is, in a study, they'll say, we lowered heart disease incidence or risks, but actually what they lowered was LDL. And
it's just that one, yeah, of course, as you'd expect, that is, in my mind, literally data fraud. And I said this a lot during the viral issue. I've just said that's data fraud. And I wasn't mincing my words, because it's not just bad practice, it's fraud. So if you take a marker that you know is a pretty useless marker, even if you believe it's important, that's not a defense for these people. You're taking a marker you know for a fact is useless and it's all over the place. Even if you believe it has any predictive power, which it really doesn't, but even if you believe it has some, but you know that it's completely all over the place, and then you use it as a proxy, that's fraud. It's fraud. Simple as.
Yes, absolutely. I like to do short, sharp interviews. The reason I asked about your critical thinking and the resilience to do this is I know you've got some workshops that you're going to be presenting, but I do want to ask you about one other thing before we get into those workshops, and that's fiber. And I just want to tell you a little story that's just happened in the last couple of days. Georgia Eade, who I think is brilliant, by the way, was on the Diary of a CEO. It's a podcast.
Was she on that?
Oh, yes.
Oh, wow. I got to watch that. George is a good friend of mine.
You
fantastic girl. That. And she did that study with Professor Westman on the 28 or so, intractable psychiatry cases in an actual hospital. And they got amazing results with keto in 3 months.
Right. Well, I think she's had over 700,000 views. But the thing that's got the biggest traction is when they talk about fiber, because the host cannot believe that fiber is not essential. And he says something along the lines of, yes, but isn't it really good because it stops you having a glucose spike? And Georgia just went, well, where are you getting all the glucose from? Yes. So this is a sort of proxy argument, isn't it? It's only going to reduce the spike if you're eating enough carbs to get a spike.
It's sneaky. But you see, people have been fed these sneaky, like they're sophists arguments. I love this, Stephen. You're British, so you're great at the language. But I didn't realize sophistication, which we think of as a good thing, I discovered a long time ago, the sophists. And the sophists had arguments that are very clever and convincing, but not correct. It was a way to debate clever but untrue arguments. Well, that's exactly this. The fiber industry and all the vegans, and they have clever but false arguments, same as the fat and the cholesterol. But Gabor Erdoshi explained this for me beautifully in 2016. I think it's worth throwing out there. I always thought of the carb as broadly not being good and unprocessed carb as not really being that bad. Hence, the indigenous populations, they don't really have a problem. They don't get diabetic if they're left alone. They don't get vegetable oil and all the other junk and refined carb. But Gabor had pureed apple and real apple and apple juice and loads of studies that pretty much proved, and mice studies and human studies, literally the problem with carbohydrate, almost by definition, is mechanical processing of it. And once you grind it down and make it, the GIP hormone fly up when you eat it, especially if you mix it with fat potentiates the problem. It's the problem. And he made the point so eloquently that fiber is only correlating with good outcomes because foods broadly with fiber, if they're unprocessed, you're just seeing that unprocessed foods are good. But what the industry has done is it takes processed foods and adds back in fiber to get the number on the box up. And that's useless. So absolutely, fiber is only a proxy for no one ground these carbs up into paste. That's all it is. The fiber itself is meaningless. Dr. Ron Rosedale said this so clearly decades ago. Fiber has no real meaning in terms of the human system, but it is an indicator, like a tracer that if it's high fiber, it indicates that the food wasn't ground up by processed food companies. That's all it is.
Yeah, and I think when you watch it, you'll love how his face, he can't believe these simple answers. And I think he also says it helps your digestion. And Georgia says, what, something that's indigestible helps.
Oh,
Now,
it's so
there
bad.
is it's so bad. There is a kicker. They've actually put a community note on that to say that fiber is essential.
Of course they have. Of course they have, because they're liars. They're frauds. But you know what? Fiber Menace is a book that came out 15 years ago. I never read it, but from the reviews, I'd say it's bang on. It probably costs $3 now on Kindle. So anyone who has any doubts about what we're saying, just get Fiber Menace. And the other thing is, I always share the study for fiber. When anyone ever asked me about fiber from the audience, I used to keep a backup slide because I didn't want to cover it by default, but I just flicked to the end of the slides. Study with 120 or something severe constipation patients. These guys are the acid test. And they basically said in the study, fiber's meant to be better for bowel movement and gut health, blah, blah, blah. However, we know mechanistically that more fiber should bind water and swell the bowel and cause it to be worse. And they listed out the reasons fiber, abrasiveness and lack of blah, blah. They listed out the reasons why every technical mechanistic indicates fiber should be worse for people with any bowel issues. But everyone says it's better, so let's test it. So they took away all their fiber, the whole group. And within a week or two, they measured, and there was 100% remission. 100% remission. Only 100 and odd people, but plenty. 100% remission. And then they did a very clever thing. They got them to roughly reintroduce half of the fiber they had been eating, like all bran and brown bread, that kind of junk fiber that they say is vital. And they roughly on the graph went halfway back to their problem. And then they closed the paper and said, fiber is an aggravator of bowel issues. Case closed.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I do want to talk about a couple of your things that you've got in the pipeline, if you don't mind, because I do think what we've talked about shows you need to be good at critical thinking, and also the pushback, you need to be a bit resilient. So just broadly speaking, what have you got in the pipeline about those two areas?
All right. Well, actually, I might, hold on a sec. I might as well show this off because I very seldom get new tech because this is my new pride and joy. I don't know if it comes out pretty well there, but basically I've got this big touch screen. So I'm doing, there's Maslow's and there's Ivor's integration of the mind. It's a bit arrogant, but I did my own triangle. Sure, why wouldn't you? But the thing is, I'll just stand in the middle anyway. And I wanted to do this properly, so I've wanted to do this for many years. So the first course I'm doing like a workshop, online workshop. It's just ivorcumminsworkshops.com. And I'm keeping the price low, so it hasn't even paid for the tech yet. I bought this 75-inch big touch screen so I can doodle and everything. And I just want to get into a real professional level workshops, 2 or 3 hours, worked exercises. And the first one I did last Thursday and Friday for New Zealand, Australia folks who signed up on resilience and mental strength. And again, I go through the best of my 25 years and all the courses I've done and my management experience in corporate and my self-management of the mind. I go through the best jewels of psychology. And I think it's really useful. It's a life's work really summarized into practical solutions for resilience. And as I say, I'll just say, I can't go into them here, but thought scanning and analysis is my fundamental for mental strength. Oh, we have Marcus Aurelius back. Belief re-encoding is super important, a little more difficult. You need to do it right. Value and purpose internalization. Most people don't realize their values give them an enormous power of mental strength and resilience in the modern world. And people don't even think about their values and how their values conflict with each other and how values mean you can make better decisions and not have regrets or anxieties. It's extremely powerful. So I consider that up the level. Prefrontal dominant refers to Professor Steve Peters and the chimp paradox. So I go through in the workshop all about the chimp versus the human prefrontal brain and how you know when which is operating, and then measuring only against the best that you can be. So that's the pinnacle. So as Marcus Aurelius said, a man despises me. That's his problem. So that's the ultimate. So there's tons of science, a few hours in the workshop. Critical thinking, I'm literally starting to pull together now. And you're absolutely right. Critical thinking, we have a black hole in the modern world. And the education system, in fairness, they, if you want to get conspiratorial, don't want the ants in the ant farm critically thinking. They're unmanageable when you've got critical thinkers. So the education is just rote learning and trust the experts for decades. So now we got a mess. So I just want to oppose that and teach critical thinking. I'm also going to include a module, though, many people have asked me for. When you're dealing with friends and spouses who maybe got all caught up with the propaganda and the mRNA, they're very stressful situations. So sure, you need mental strength and resilience, but you also not only need critical thinking skills, how to read scientific papers, how to use logic and comparative analysis, how to properly assess a scenario and get the right answer. But I'm also going to have to develop a big chunk of the workshop on how to manage people who don't have the benefit that you have. And propagandize people, we talked offline, you have to be pretty damn good at active cognitive communication to deal with someone who's in a mass formation, who's truly like hypnotized. And these people are. It may be your spouse, but I always advise to have a lot of empathy, though. It's hard, but you must have empathy for people who have been brainwashed. I mean, as Professor Matthias Desmet eloquently pointed out, and I interviewed him, he's been all over the place, beautifully pointed out, these people are in a mass formation. They are profoundly psychologically, kind of indoctrinated. And you can't really give out about them. You have to say, well, can I help them? So a lot of this is about just being very stoical. And stoicism wasn't all about just the strength and resilience. It was about accommodating other humans and being virtuous and dealing with people in the best possible way that you could deal with people. So stoicism is more than just being a hard guy, right?
Brilliant. I think it's going to have such a good place in this way of eating, because I think the more we all learn, one of the things I always say is the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. I think we have to get across to people, in a way that they understand, and I think a lot of very compelling people just know how to communicate on the plant-based side. They've got the money, they've got the advertising, they've got the propaganda, and they've got everything behind them. Well, but we've got rights behind us. I know that's really cliched, but we have clinical experience, people actually reversing these conditions, reversing, I've got success stories on my YouTube channel of people reversing their kidney disease, fatty liver disease, type 2 diabetes, blood pressure, mental health is improving. We've just got so many people doing this that we've got to find a way, like you say. So that what you're doing, Ivor, is I think will become actually quite a key tenet in what a lot of people are trying to do, because it isn't about this way of eating. It's about this way of communicating as well, because you've got to get people on board. Got to. And if your friends and family can't believe their own eyes, you've got to have tactics and methods to be able to say to them, literally what you just said. I know you're brainwashed, but we've got to.
You don't tell them. Don't say that.
I know. No, I'm paraphrasing. But these are the things that I want to tell you, and this is how we need to communicate.
And on the diet and health, well, I'm going to do one on weight loss mastery and put together the best I've kind of learned over the last decades. But the weight loss mastery course will actually include a good chunk of the psychology from mental strength and stoicism. Because, of course, myself and Dr. Gerber in our book, Eat Rich, Live Long, we had a section on habit forming and psychology. But that needs to be expanded out now with the chimp model and our more recent learnings there's a huge part, obviously, of weight loss where people fail from the psychology. In fact, you could say that's the root of it, because once you eat the correct foods, the weight loss will naturally happen generally. The problem is falling off the wagon, and that's psychology. And you need to understand why you fall off. It's not because you're weak or you're a weak person. That's labeling. People label themselves. They don't realize they have a non-quiescent, quite active chimp brain, which they inherited at birth. It's their accountability to manage it, but it's not their fault if their chimp is very active. They need to learn to manage that deep primordial. And the primordial brain, unfortunately, will eat all it can get its hands on, because it's just fight, flight, freeze, and feeding and indulgence. So anyway, long story, but I'm going to have quite a bit of psychology in the weight loss for that reason. Yeah, for sure.
Brilliant. Well, Ivor, thanks for your time. I won't take up any more of it. It's been a big pleasure to meet you again online.
Absolutely, Stephen. And we'll do it again. Cheers.